Hello and welcome to this week's tutorial. I'm going to be painting two of the Evolution miniatures figures for the post-apocalyptic diorama. So first up, the figure I want to get a different black leather effect to the last figure I painted. So the jacket was base coated with Lifecolor Deep cockpit, quite diluted. Now when this was dry I thought the tone looked a little too light, so a diluted coat of Citadel contrast paint was applied. You can see quite liberally over the top, and this just darkened the base coat of the jacket down quite nicely and picked out some of the details. Now I found with the contrast paints they take a little longer to dry, so once this was painted on it was left overnight to cure properly. Now the first shadow accents were added using Vallejo Black, reasonably diluted, and this process of adding highlights and shadows sort of went backwards and forwards. It wasn't like I added all the shadows and then all the highlights. I had the wet palette, so I could almost do it on the fly, as it were. As I'm seeing areas of interest I could pick those out. So this took quite a while. You can see here I'm adding a lighter grey to the tops of the creases, and various shades were used to really bring out the detail. You can see that it slowly starts coming together. See there's some more shadows being added here with the Vallejo Black, and again as you add highlights it brings out areas that may need shadow coats as well. So as I said, I was going backwards and forwards for quite a while getting the highlights and shadows done. So getting towards the end of the jacket, painting the jacket, I added a diluted Vallejo Black, almost a wash, around areas such as the straps for the rucksack, areas of deep shadow. And then once this was done, as you can see it took quite a while because there is quite a bit of detail. I went back and added some even deeper shadows with pretty much undiluted Vallejo Black. So the final stage, some final very light highlights, just in areas that really stood out and areas that may have been blocked out a little bit by the wash. So with that done, the trousers were given a base coat of Citadel Desert Yellow, quite a diluted coat, so it really went into the recesses of the paint, and some paint retarder was added. So when I added things like, you can see here, the burnt umber wash, it really fused with the base coat of the paint to produce a very sort of worn in grime to the material. Then various highlights were added, as in pretty much the same way the leather jacket, not to that extent, but highlights and shadows were added with a lightened and darkened coat of the base coat. While this was drying, I painted the gas mask with Lifecolor Sky Blue, and this was applied quite a thick coat because obviously it's a rubber compound effectively, so you want it to be as effective as possible. The rucksack was then painted with Lifecolor Dark Green while everything else was drying. Again, quite a diluted coat, so it just went into the recesses. And once the paint on the gas mask had dried, an overall wash of MIG Oilbrusher Starship Filth was added, and this is a really good colour. It's got a very grimy, gritty kind of appearance, and it worked really well on the gas mask. Continuing the weathering, once the base coat of the rucksack had been left to dry for a little while, a overall wash of Vallejo Burnt Umber paint, very diluted, was added, and I think this works really well. It's got a really nice grimy appearance, and it just complements the model really nicely. The ropes had been painted with Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet, and then a highlight was added just on areas that would catch the light, just to add an extra area of interest and your eyes drawn to it as well. The gun was given an overall coat of Lifecolor Burnt Black, again from the Shades of Black set, which I used a lot in the last tutorial and several colours in this tutorial. And this is reasonably diluted, so it will really go into the details and show out the recesses of the gun. Now the bedroll was painted a slightly darkened Lifecolor Dark Green to contrast. It would look a little odd if it was the same colour as the rucksack, so it's given quite a liberal coating, then weathered, and with that the model was pretty much done. Just a few extra highlights were added and that was it really. So here we see the finished figure, really quite pleased with it, and now it's on to the next. So the next figure had quite an extreme pre-shade applied because obviously the gas cape is just going to be one colour, so I wanted as much contrast to work with as possible when I painted on the base coat. So I used a heavily diluted coat of Lifecolor Interior Green with quite a bit of paint retarder added. And one unforeseen byproduct of this was you could really stipple the paint on to give it a really nice texture. You've got to be careful though, because the base coat is quite fragile. The retarder means the paint doesn't adhere to the model as well as it would do normally. So next up, some highlights were added using quite a significantly lightened coat of the base coat. I thought the material of the coat is obviously a sort of plastic rubber kind of compound, so that the highlights would be really quite extreme where they got caught by the light. So various highlights were added, almost the last one, as you see next, that I applied being white. Now again, where the paint retarder was used, you could blend in these colours to make them maybe a bit less stark. So as you can see here, one of the final highlight stages is almost a white, it's a very light version of the base coat, just to bring out areas that would really catch the light. And in much the same respect, when the shadows were applied, it was a very darkened version of the base coat was added, just to really provide as much contrast as possible. And again, where the paint retarder had been used, you could blend these in with the brush, which worked really quite nicely. Areas around the hood, obviously the contrast would be really noticeable, so it was almost a wash of dark green was added to go in the creases around there, and obviously other highlights were added just to really improve upon the effect. And once again, a wash of burnt umber was added to really add some ground in dirt to the area, and again, where the paint retarder was used, you could really work this into the base coat, which worked really quite nicely. And subsequent coats, as you see, were added later on. So I thought the effect looked a little stark, so a very thin wash of Vallejo Green was added with some of the paint medium, the sort of satin medium, to give it a slightly shiny effect. Not too much, you've got to be very careful with gloss effects on models, but it gave it a really nice, vulcanized rubber kind of look. And obviously this is applied all over the model. Had to be careful that it didn't pull up too much into areas of detail or run into areas that you didn't want it to. So you had to sit there with the brush and basically pull it out of areas that weren't suitable. So another coat of burnt umber was added, just because obviously some had been covered over by the wash. Again, areas around the bottom of the coat, so on and so forth, but other splashes higher up, just worn in dirt that had accrued over time. So the staff was then painted with Lifecolor Warm Wood from the Weathered Wood painting set. And this is left as is. A lot of the weathering is going to take place when the rest of the diorama is finished, just to really unify everything into the scene. The backpack was given a coat of Lifecolor French Blue. This is quite diluted. And I thought the blue added a really nice contrast to the green of the gas cape. Some final washes were added using Vallejo Black, very diluted, just the extreme shadows, the real dark areas of the model. And as you can see here, around where the straps of the rucksack go over the shoulder, just to provide a contrast, so it looks sort of embedded in the material, as it were. And this was pretty much the final part of the painting process, but well worth doing because it's just a final chance to bring out the detail. You see some other more selective pin washes were added around the buttons and the seams of the coat, and with that the model was pretty much finished. So here we see the finished figures. They were great fun to paint. So next time I should have a figure and hopefully some of the diorama done. So I shall see you next week, and take care.